Morning, everyone, and welcome to the Day Ahead Market Enhancements Workshop. Today we'll be covering some of the items that we didn't get to last Wednesday. So the presentation, the materials are the same. They're available out on the Day Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative webpage, and you can get to that page by going to CISO.com. You'll go to the Stay Informed tab, click Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to our main initiative landing page. And then if you scroll down, you'll see the Day Ahead Market Enhancements Initiative. And if you click that link, it'll take you to the page where you can find the presentation. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the workshop today. So before we get started, just a couple housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need technical assistance during today's workshop at any point, you can send a chat to the event producer. Her name is Sharon. As far as the agenda goes for today, in a moment I'll hand it over to James to pick up where we left off last Wednesday. So we'll be discussing the variable energy resource eligibility for imbalanced reserve and reliability capacity, and then also energy storage resources and capacity procurement. And then we'll wrap up the workshop today with some next steps. So again, this slide here just shows where we are at in the stakeholder process. We're here at the straw proposal stage under proposal development, and our next step would be to publish a fourth revised straw proposal at the beginning of October. So with that, I will hand it over to James Friedrich, our lead policy developer, to kick us off.
Thank you, Isabella. So we will cover two topics that we did not get to in last week's game workshop. So looking forward to discussing these with you all. Let's go to the next slide. So the first topic we're going to discuss is how variable energy resources, and by that term we're primarily talking about wind and solar resources, how they are eligible for providing imbalanced reserve and reliability capacity. So in the last proposal, we didn't write much about this issue and deferred our proposals into the next, upcoming proposal because we were still sort of thinking about how we would design or how we would enable variable energy resources to participate in these new products. Ultimately, though, we did say in the last proposal and continue to maintain that we think it is appropriate that variable energy resources should be eligible to provide these capacity products in both directions. We feel that these resource types should not be included from participating in market products that they're technically capable of providing. But with that said, we do have some concerns about variable energy resources having capacity awards above their forecasts, which we feel would undermine the reliability of the market. And so these same concerns do not apply to the downward products, of course, only in the upward direction. So as I mentioned, we deferred the specific mechanics of how VERS would participate in these products. Just a little bit of history on this issue. In proposals past, we had considered creating sort of two classes of VERS, one in which we would restrict the upper economic limit, that is the maximum amount of bid capacity that a VER can provide, restricting it to its forecast, and if the VER agrees to that, would enable them to provide the upward capacity products. And then a second class of VER which participates the way VERs do today, where in IFM at least there's no restriction to the quantity of output that VER can bid into the market. And because it can today participate, with bids above their forecast, we would be reluctant to allow them to hold upward capacity if they're bidding above their forecast. So we would have not allowed them to participate in the upward products. Let's go to the next slide. So starting with imbalanced reserves, we're essentially taking the first option or the first class of VER that I just described and sort of applying it to all, or propose to apply it to all VERs, in which case we would restrict the upper economic limit of VERs in the IFM to their forecasts, which essentially is another way of saying that we would not allow them a bid quantity in the day-ahead market above their forecasted amount. And VERs, of course, if they want to take, a financial position in the day-ahead market that's different or above beyond their forecast, they can offer in virtual supply, to augment their position if they want to do so. And because of this restriction, we would feel comfortable that all variable energy resources are eligible to receive imbalanced reserve up awards. And so this last bullet essentially says that not only would we restrict the upper economic limit in IFM to the VER forecast, but we would have a capacity constraint in the market where the imbalanced reserve, the combination of imbalanced reserve awards and energy awards must be less than or equal to their forecasted amount. So, acknowledging that there were some comments, stakeholder comments that felt like it was inappropriate for VERs, especially to hold imbalanced reserves, because the imbalanced reserve procurement target itself is based on VER uncertainty. We think that this is at least a reasonable restriction, that if a VER were to be able to hold imbalanced reserve, the capacity and energy sum has to be less than their forecast, so at least they're not holding capacity above what we think their forecasted value is. And two other thoughts. One is that, it's not very likely that in most conditions, given the way that VERs participate in the energy market specifically, they're very low to or zero marginal costs, sometimes bidding negative dollar amounts for energy. It's not, we wouldn't expect it to be very common that a VER resource would have an imbalanced reserve up award under most conditions, because they're so cheap to provide energy that the opportunity cost for them to provide imbalanced reserves would be quite high. That being said, we don't think that's any reason to restrict them from providing it if the economics works out that way. We just don't expect that VERs would carry very many imbalanced reserve awards. And the third point, of course, is that if a VER resource is bidding for imbalanced reserves up, it is assuming the financial risk of not being able to provide the imbalanced reserve capacity in the real-time market, and would be subject to deviation settlement or potentially no-pay type settlement if it wasn't able to provide the award. And so there is already, because the comment said it's risky to hold imbalanced reserves on VER resources, that risk is sort of already baked into the settlement of imbalanced reserve, and therefore we can allow the resource provider to bid in whatever makes most sense for their resource, and the ISO doesn't have to manage that. Let's go to the next slide, and then I'll pause for questions. So now for reliability capacity, we're proposing that VERs must bid their reliability capacity up quantity to their forecast value. And if a VER resource does not provide sufficient reliability capacity up bids, that the ISO would insert bids for them up to their forecast at a bid price of $0. Now, I just want to point out, in the slide it says, we would insert bids at a price of $0. Actually think that depending on the direction of the discussion we had last week about default bids for reliability capacity that we would use for mitigation, to the extent we develop a default bid for reliability capacity mitigation, it would probably be more appropriate to insert the bids at that default bid price and not $0, but just wanted to point that out. Now, staying on that bullet, it is really important that VERs are participating in the RUC process with our RCU bids up to their forecast, because we need that physical supply to be present, all of that physical supply to be present in the RUC process, because that is what the RUC capacity is procuring to. It's looking for physical supply to meet the forecasted amount. And so if the VERs are not bidding reliability capacity up to their forecast, then you're essentially leaving out available physical supply from the RUC process, and the solution would not be as optimal. Of course, it would be fair then, going to the second bullet here, that we have no pay rules for reliability capacity, and a VER, a VER resource could say, well, I'm going to be obligated to provide reliability capacity, but what if my forecasted value in real time, I can't meet my day ahead forecast in real time. Clouds come over or something happens and I'm not able to meet my forecast, then I'm on the hook to paying back the reliability capacity. So in the proposal, we had initially said that if a resource was not able to provide reliability capacity up, then they would have to pay back the higher of the reliability capacity price or the RTPD, flexible ramping up price. And we are thinking about changing that to just having the RCU no pay apply to the RCU price. And essentially that means that if a VER resource had a reliability capacity up award based on their forecast in the day ahead market, and they could not deliver to that forecast in real time, that they're essentially held harmless in real time. They do pay back the reliability capacity up price, but from a total financial perspective, they're no worse off having held that reliability capacity up award. And then we would also propose to remove variable energy resources from the RCU and RCD cost allocation, because really at this point, the VERs no longer contribute to the reliability capacity up and down procurement targets. Whereas before we were incorporating the differences between the VER forecast and the VER bids into the RCU, RCD requirement, we're no longer proposing to do that, and so we can take them out of the cost allocation. Okay, I'll move on to questions.
Okay, let's go to Alva.
Good morning.
Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me, James?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just a couple of thoughts here, and I realize that you're kind of combining design and implementation here, but it seems like the correct solution to achieve what you want to achieve would be to not overwrite an existing bid that somebody might have put in up to a certain level, but to insert an additional segment for the portion that you feel CAISO should, is essentially entitled to. So I mean, I realize you may not be able to do that, but effect of this approach is going to be that if somebody puts in a bid, they may have some evaluation of what their bid price should be, and it's at any level below the forecast, you're going to simply replace it with a zero bid, which doesn't seem the correct outcome there. So just a comment. I don't know that there's, I realize you're trying to figure out how to do all of this in the time frame that you have, but this has been an issue I think in other contexts as well, that really ancillary service bids should potentially have multiple segments, and in this particular case, I think there's a strong argument for it.
Yeah, so let me clarify a little bit and see if that helps a little. So already today, and before I go into that, are you talking specifically about either imbalanced reserve or reliability capacity, or sort of generally talking about both?
Well, I'm really just looking at this slide because I got onto the call late, and just it says that CAISO will insert an RCU bid at a bid price of zero if the resource doesn't bid up to its VER forecast. So if you had it, and I'm reading that as if you had a bid in there that was below the VER forecast, you would insert, but effectively you would overwrite the bid. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but there's no capability to recognize two segments currently on any non-energy product. So that was my question, or asking you for comment on that.
Yeah, okay. So today in RUC, we already limit the quantity of bids that can be considered in RUC on a VER. So they're already limited to their forecast in the RUC process. Essentially, what we're saying is that if they bid for reliability capacity up in a quantity that's less than their forecast, we would just extend the bid. We wouldn't sort of overwrite the bid. And maybe George can answer the question about whether or not RUC would need to, I guess that based on what you're saying, RUC would probably need to support the consideration of multi-segments.
Well,
maybe George can comment.
Before you go there, what you said is different from what's here on the slide, and I think that's probably an acceptable solution. I was looking at it as if I'm reading exactly what it says here, and it says you're going to insert a bid at a bid price of zero if the bid is not up to their VER forecast. So if it were something below, this is what the bullet is saying. But I think what you said is CAISO will extend the bid at the bid price that's submitted up to the forecast, which people could have problems with that, but I think that's an acceptable solution. So that's just
that's probably a more clear way to describe what I'm trying to get at. So apologies if the slide is not as clear as it should be. And the term insert just generally is trying to show that resources are bidding for reliability capacity in cyber at some quantity, and that if that quantity is insufficient, maybe extend instead of insert. CAISO will extend the bid, maybe a better way, because insert does maybe make it look like we're taking the old bid and replacing it with something else.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you, James.
And also in this sub-bullet, it should also clarify if they do not bid reliability capacity up to their VER forecast. It's not energy that we're looking at for this particular rule. So if the reliability capacity bid itself is short of their forecast, we would just extend the bid to the forecast.
And in general, you could eliminate this problem as a bidder by simply putting in a RCU bid at your PMAX, which would then be taken down to the forecast by CAISO in the market. So that would be a way of guaranteeing that there's no issue with this, I suppose.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Callie.
Hi, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. I appreciate that conversation you just had with Ava. I had kind of a similar reaction. So just to confirm your first bullet here, you're actually proposing that the CAISO will extend the RCU bid for VERS at the bid price they originally submitted, not at zero?
Well, I think we are thinking about it being, well, there's a couple different things we could do with the bid price. We could have it be zero. We could have it be whatever the resource bid for reliability capacity itself, or we could also insert it at, if we come up with a default bid for reliability capacity for mitigation, we could also submit that price. So we were initially thinking $0 price, but maybe a different price is more appropriate if we're extending the bid.
Okay, so your first option of zero and your second option or third option of a default energy bid would then also have to require REC to support multi-segment for this product. And then you would also have to think about how you would adjust the bids or extend the bids to maintain monotonically increasing bids, right? If their original price is below the DEB, then extending it at the DEB at the upper bound would be fine. But if the bid was above the DEB, you'd have to kind of shift everything out. So yeah, I think a reasonable approach would be just to extend it at the bid price they submitted, but we'll go back and think about that a little bit more. But my original question was back on the previous slide. I just want to make sure I understood what you were saying when you were talking about restricting the bids for IRU. Are you restricting their energy offer bids to their forecast or just their IRU bids to their forecast?
Both. We would be restricting energy bids to their forecast and the sum of, we would be restricting energy, restricting energy bids to the forecast, and then restricting the third bullet is awards. So we would be restricting energy plus Imbalanced Reserve awards to less than or equal to the forecast.
Okay, so I guess my question is, if you're restricting the awards, which I understand why you would do that, to energy plus IRU less than the forecast, is there any need to restrict their bids? Because could you end up in a situation where a resource submits energy and IRU, but is not awarded any IRU? So why wouldn't, I guess I'm trying to understand why you wouldn't want that resource to then be able to participate like they do today, to where they could submit energy offers and be awarded above their VERS forecast. So I'm wondering if you really just need to restrict the total award.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense to me, because if you have this constraint here, it doesn't really matter if you bid $1 million for energy. You're only going to be restricted an award, to meet this constraint. Is that kind of what you're saying? It's sort of redundant.
Yeah, and then what it would do is, if you just did that third bullet, is it would allow for resources that are not awarded IRU to continue being awarded as they are today, to where if they do bid above their forecast and are awarded above their forecast without any IRU awards, that's fine.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good comment.
Just a thought.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, thanks. That's all I had.
Thank you. Yep.
There are no further questions at this time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the feedback. That's very helpful. As we move into the proposal, we can get those things refined. So let's switch topics now to something sort of new that we're talking about in DAME, relating to energy storage resources and capacity procurement. So I just want to frame this topic a little bit. This is something that we've been discussing internally. This is, of course, these workshops are not proposals. These are, ideas. So we're open to feedback and how we can improve, on these ideas here. But just making that framing here. So let's talk a little bit about the state of charge constraints. So today, it's proposed that in DAME, the ISM would limit the capacity that can be awarded to an energy storage resource so as not to violate state of charge constraints, and that's pretty straightforward. If we go to the next slide, we'll start to sort of break these equations down a little bit. So let's start with this upper equation. This upper equation essentially says that a resource's state of charge in the current interval is the state of charge from the previous interval plus or minus the current interval's charging or discharging schedule. So that makes sense, right? It's just you take your state of charge from the last interval, add or subtract whatever charging or discharging awards you got, that makes your current state of charge. Let's go to the next slide. The second equation says that the sum of all of your upward capacity awards, that would be, in this equation, reg up, spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve, and balance reserve up, cannot exceed the quantity between the resource's current state of charge and its minimum state of charge. So the minimum state of charge is the leftmost term, the SOC with a bar below it, and the current state of charge is the term on the right-hand side of the equation, the SOC sub IT. So again, you take your minimum state of charge and you add up all of your upward capacity awards. That value cannot exceed your current state of charge. Now your next slide. Now this equation is basically saying that the sum of your downward capacity awards, so in the equation that's RD or regulation down, and IRD, which is imbalanced reserve down, cannot exceed the quantity between the resource's current state of charge and its maximum state of charge. So the current state of charge is the term on the left-hand side of the equation, and the maximum state of charge is the SOC with the bar on top. Okay? So those are pretty straightforward. Let's go to the next slide. So here's a visual example of this constraint in action. Consider a 4 megawatt hour battery, and its capacity is shown in the blue rectangle. And assume that its current state of charge is 1 megawatt hour. So it's got a quarter of capacity, it's quarter of the way charged. And it has a minimum state of charge of half a megawatt hour. So it has a little bit of state of charge there in that range. And the state of charge capacity constraint would make sure that the sum of the upward capacities from the day-ahead market cannot exceed this range within any hourly interval. Okay, so your combination of your energy awards plus any upward capacity service cannot be greater than this value here, illustrated here. But that's not necessarily the case between intervals over time. So let's go to the next slide. So here you have that same resource, and it is spread out over 4 different intervals. Let's assume this is the day-ahead market, and that each of these rectangles is the unit position in 4 separate hours, okay? So in the day-ahead market, this resource can get imbalanced reserve up awards over several consecutive hours. So, you know, we're assuming in this illustration here that the state of charge on this resource is the same across the 4-hour period, meaning that it's not receiving a charging or discharging award in any of these hours. So its state of charge stays the same, and the state of charge constraint will work to make sure that within any given hour, the imbalanced reserve award does not exceed or does not extend beyond these yellow bars in any of the hours. So you can see the green imbalanced reserve awards fit nicely within the yellow bars. That would not violate the state of charge constraint. And so you can have a situation where from the day-ahead market can schedule this resource for imbalanced reserve across all 4 of these intervals for some quantity. Now let's go to the next slide, and we'll assume this next slide is sort of what could happen in the real-time market. This storage resource has, with its imbalanced reserve award, an obligation to bid that imbalanced reserve as economic energy. And we're assuming in this example that the resource is bidding and it gets picked up, dispatched to provide energy in the first interval. And so after the first interval, you have, let's say, half of its state of charge constraint, or half of its state of charge consumed in the first interval, and then you move to the next interval. It's also dispatched to provide energy. And then in intervals 3 and 4, there's no state of charge left on this resource to continue to provide the imbalanced reserve up awards. So the summary being that the resource may not have sufficient state of charge to maintain its imbalanced reserve awards across a multiple hour period. Next slide. So it's a little bit more of a summary. The state of charge formulation does not assume, as it's written today in the day-ahead market enhancements technical appendix, does not assume that capacity awards ultimately increase or decrease the state of charge. The state of charge only increases or decreases relative to either charging or discharging awards themselves. Our concern is that this could result in what we'll phrase leaky capacity and may potentially dilute the quantity of reserves that are held across the day. And we also potentially create sort of a disconnect between the way storage resources are incentivized to participate in the market and the way that they can be most useful to the system. So what we mean by this is that if you think about the previous slide, the system wants and really needs this resource to be providing that economic energy across all of those hours that it's awarded. It's relying on that imbalanced reserve across all of those hours. When load uncertainty materializes, we want to make sure we have those incremental bids to provide real-time energy if they're needed. But at the same time, if you're a storage resource owner, you have to manage your state of charge in the real-time market through your bids, and it may be more financially beneficial to you to participate in the real-time market through bids in a way that's not like the previous slide, and you're potentially exposed to like imbalanced reserve, no pay settlements, and other things that you have to manage. So let's go to the next slide. So this is not a proposal. This is not a proposal, but this is a place where we can begin discussion. This equation on the top attempts to extend the ideas that we presented in the beginning of the presentation about how the state of charge constraint works and adds these red terms, and I'll explain what these red terms are. So these red terms essentially are upward and downward capacity products, okay, that are now put into the state of charge constraint itself. And what they would do is they would assume that if a storage resource receives either an upward or downward capacity award, that it would somehow impact the resource's state of charge. And it would do so using a coefficient factor that's in front of each term. So let's look at A sub RU times RU, which is some coefficient times a regulation up award. So we could set this coefficient A sub RU to reflect some, historical probability that this state of charge or this resource would actually consume this regulation up award as energy, and therefore reduce its usable state of charge for the next interval. Same with the next term, spinning reserve, non-spinning reserve, and R. Each has its own separate coefficient that we could set as to be what the likelihood of use of that capacity product is. Now, for imbalanced reserve, there is no coefficient. There is no configurable coefficient here. So the way this equation is written out assumes that all of the imbalanced reserve, both up and down, if you notice, is fully consumed as energy in the real time. So it would be, if you receive an imbalanced reserve up award, you would consume potentially all of that award towards your state of charge usable for the next interval. So what that would mean is that if you think back to the previous illustrations, that the day-ahead market would not be able to award that resource imbalanced reserves over that 4-hour stretch, because it would assume that the state of charge is consumed by the imbalanced reserve awards in the first 2 intervals, and therefore assume no state of charge remaining for intervals 3 and 4, and would not get a state of charge or an imbalanced reserve award. So I'll stop there, and I hope this makes sense. And yeah, looking forward to questions or feedback.
Okay, let's go to Callie Wells. Can we unmute Callie?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm still hearing a beeping on my end. Are you guys hearing that?
Nope.
Weird. Okay, that's off. Sorry. I was still muted on your guys' system. This is Callie Wells with WPTF. So quick question on this. So I know you have that coefficient term here on Reg Up, spin and non-spin. In the energy storage enhancements initiative, where you're also introducing a similar change to this formulation, that effort has not talked about including spinning reserves and non-spinning reserves in this adjustment. Can you connect the two? Are you just assuming here, is the proposal here to assume the coefficient on spin and non-spin is 0, and you're just showing the formulations here as illustrative? Or are you now also changing what's being proposed in energy storage to now include some sort of coefficient on spinning and non-spin?
I think for now it's illustrative, but there may be merit to extending that idea presented in energy storage enhancements to include all of the capacity products from the ISM. And in this state of charge formulation, that includes spin, non-spin, and imbalanced reserves in both directions. So that's kind of, yeah, I mean, we're discussing the merits of potentially extending that here.
Okay, yeah, I would just ask that be made clear in the energy storage enhancements, because the conversations there have been always that, well, we don't deploy spin and non-spin unless we're in contingency conditions. So because of that, we're not going to be adjusting state of charge as reflecting spin and non-spin awards. That's been kind of the discussion over there. And now it sounds like, well, maybe we're opening that conversation again, or that door. I just ask that the messages are consistent across those two initiatives, and maybe it's just a matter of circling back with the energy storage enhancements. But just wanted to make sure that what's being discussed there is consistent with what's being discussed here, because it is changing the exact same formula in both efforts. So my other question is on IRU and IRD. So you're assuming that basically 100% of that will be, 100% of the uncertainty will materialize in real time?
This equation does that, yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm wondering if when you guys do the next iteration of the proposal, if you can include some examples, similar to how a couple slides earlier you walked through kind of that 4-hour example with the day ahead to show the issue. But I do wonder if you're assuming 100% deployment in real time, and maybe it doesn't actually materialize, but this resource has energy offers that it's self-scheduling in real time, that it could actually create an infeasibility of the state of charge in real time because you're assuming 100% deployment in day ahead, and now that resource can't meet its day ahead energy schedule. So if you can, I haven't thought through an example. This is the first time, I'm trying to think through the impacts there. So I'll continue giving that some thought, but I think what would be useful then in the paper, if you can kind of walk through that scenario with some examples, would be really helpful, so we can make sure that there's nothing, no unintended outcomes by assuming 100% deployment when you're adjusting the state of charge in real time. Or sorry, in day ahead.
Yep. Yeah, so a couple comments. So, back first to sort of the spin and non-spin here. We can configure these terms in the constraint and set the coefficients to be 0, at least at the beginning. So that's still an option, but just to have the coefficients configured so that if that no longer becomes appropriate, they can be adjusted. And then, yeah, for again, even the idea that, the assumed coefficient here for imbalance reserves up and down is 1, which again interprets to, we're assuming all of the imbalance reserve award is consumed by state, or, consumed within the state of charge, is admittedly is restrictive. It may be appropriate to be that restrictive, but, it could potentially also be that we have, a coefficient less than 1, which, may not reduce the imbalance reserve up and down awards fully to the, or the state of charge fully to the imbalance reserve up and down awards. And like you said, I think there are interactions that we need to think through. So that's why I preface this as sort of a conversation starter to get some feedback about how people are feeling about this, and we'll continue to sort of think about what those interactions might be.
Yeah, really appreciate that. Yeah, so some examples in the next paper would be extremely useful. And on the spin and non-spin, I understand wanting to kind of have that configurable parameter in the market if you're going to be changing the optimization to begin with. But I would, again, just make sure the conversations are consistent between the two policy efforts right now, because if you are going to be implementing this with a configurable parameter, if down the road you go to change it, we'd want to make sure that actually goes through a stakeholder process and has an open discussion. And so if that is what you are planning on doing, then having, I think, the conversation be consistent across the two policy efforts would be really useful. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Alva.
Hi, also Bora PG&E. This is really following on Callie's comments, but I want to thinking about an example which makes this kind of absurd, but really gets to the question of what is really, I mean, it's not absurd, but it shows there's a difficulty here, which is, suppose you have a battery that, let's just suppose it starts at full charge and it's a 4-hour battery. It receives 4 hours of imbalance reserve up awards in sequence. This equation will then say that in the 5th hour, the battery is at minimum, and the only direction you can go is to actually physically charge the battery in order to make it capable of doing anything that requires state of charge. Of course, if it's providing, breakdown, then there's no issue, but let's just suppose that the awards are in that direction. So you're then, the optimization itself is going to be having an energy award in the 5th hour to support the 4 hours of imbalance reserve. And that energy award does not seem like the same kind of energy award as one that is, intended to actually be deployed because you don't know that the imbalance reserve is going to be deployed. And so there's a much higher likelihood that energy award is going to have to be reversed potentially disadvantageously just because of the way that you've procured the imbalanced reserves. So I think there's a problem here. I think that this approach, the problem you're trying to solve is real, and it needs to be dealt with in some way where you're constraining the state of charge limits so that you're ensured you have capability to meet the constraints. But I'm not confident that this approach, and it doesn't matter whether it's 100% or 50%, because 8 hours is the same as 4 hours, right? I mean, you can, if a battery looks economic for 8 hours in the imbalanced reserve direction, you're going to then be potentially putting a charge schedule on a fully charged battery that's going to be fully charged at the point where it's received its award, simply because of this constraint. Maybe it's more and I'm just seeing this for the first time, so I just think it's really interesting, and I appreciate your presenting the idea, but maybe something that's more like what you do with regulation, where you say, well, we need to ensure that there's half an hour of capability. Maybe you just ensure that the state of charge has to be within an hour's worth of all services that are being procured on a resource. So if you're procuring imbalanced reserve up, just as if you were procuring regulation day ahead, you would have to have an hour's worth of state of charge in the solution. That might be a more appropriate solution to start with, because I think this will lead to some spurious awards that could be disadvantageous to operators.
Yeah, I think your example is really good. Yeah, it does illustrate, in my mind at least, an important challenge, which is that future awards are going to be dictated across, or future awards are going to be given considering a state of charge that has certain assumptions, like you had in your example about the 4-hour battery that's getting imbalanced reserves in each interval, and then you're assuming in hour 5 then a certain level of state of charge. Now, the day-ahead market, of course, over the 24-hour horizon is going to optimize around that.
Right.
That may prevent a little bit of sort of this oscillating, these oscillating awards going on. But at the same time, I do get your point that you're making assumptions about the future position of this resource that I like the term spurious, may be getting spurious awards down the road, sort of later in the intervals.
Right. And I don't think oscillation is so much the issue, because I think, in a sense, you want more oscillation in the solution, so that what you're trying to get is that these services and everything on the batteries gets spread out over more hours, over more batteries, so that you don't have too much being concentrated on a single battery. And I appreciate that need as well, that you want to use the whole portfolio of batteries over the whole day in the best way. I just think it's more the issue of that the co-optimizing among all these different services over the course of the day could lead to some results that would be seen as not fair to the market participants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll think about that some more.
Thanks.
And I appreciate, even though this is the first time folks are seeing this, provide some of your sort of gut reaction. It's still helpful for us to consider as we turn back to the proposal after this.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any.
No further questions at this time.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I think that takes us to our next steps. So as mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, our next step is to publish the 4th revised draft proposal. Right now we are targeting the week of October 6th, and then holding a stakeholder call the following week, the week of the 14th, with comments due 2 weeks later, the week of October 28th. So again, these presentation materials are available out on the initiative webpage. And again, you can get to that page by going to CAISO.com, clicking Stay Informed, and then going down to Policy Initiatives, and then selecting Day Ahead Market Enhancements. And there's a direct link on this page as well. And if you have any questions, you can send an email to myself. My email is listed here on this slide, or you can send it to ISO-stakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And then just some last reminders, we are holding the 2022 Stakeholder Symposium this year down in downtown Sacramento at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center. It'll be on November 9th and 10th, and it's our first symposium since 2018. So we're very excited to welcome everyone back. And if you haven't registered already, you can do so by going to CAISO.com. You'll click that Stay Informed tab again, and then it'll be linked there, the Stakeholder Symposium website. And then also we do have sponsorship opportunities available for the symposium. And so if you're interested in sponsoring the event, you can go to that same symposium webpage, click sponsors and sponsorships, and then you'll find more information on that page. So I'll just open it up here for any last questions before we conclude. Okay, not seeing anyone. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week.